The thermometer read -68 degrees Celsius when Thomas Garrett broke through the ice ceiling of his shelter for the first time in 11 days. Above him, where the valley should have been visible, there was only white a solid wall of snow that had swallowed entire cabins, buried full-grown pine trees, and erased every landmark he had known for 7 years. The blizzard that would be remembered as the White Death of 1842 had claimed 23 lives in the Silver Creek Valley, but Garrett had survived using a technique so unconventional that other miners had mocked him for it just 3 weeks earlier. What he built beneath his cabin that autumn would not only save his life, but would fundamentally change how people survived winter in the most dangerous corners of the American frontier. Before we dig into this incredible story of survival and innovation, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, especially if you've ever experienced a serious winter storm. And if you want to hear more unbelievable true stories from history that you've probably never heard before, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story about a lighthouse keeper who discovered something impossible washing up on shore is even more mind-blowing than this one. Thomas Garrett stood at the edge of Silver Creek Valley on November 3, 1842, watching clouds move in patterns he had never seen in 24 years of mountain living. The formations rolled backward against the prevailing wind, folding into themselves like dough being kneaded by invisible hands. The air pressure made his old bullet wound ache, a Cherokee musket ball still lodged in his shoulder from his youth in Tennessee. That pain had predicted weather for 2 decades, but never had it throbbed with this peculiar rhythm: 3 pulses, pause, 3 pulses, pause, like a telegraph message from the atmosphere itself. The Silver Creek Valley stretched below him, dotted with the cabins of 43 miners who had come for the gold discovered 2 years earlier. Smoke rose from chimneys in straight columns, undisturbed by wind. That stillness bothered Garrett more than any storm would have. He had seen nature hold its breath before unleashing fury in the Appalachians, witnessed the same ominous quiet before tornadoes in Missouri, and learned to read the mountain's moods during his years trapping beaver, before the gold drew him here. This silence felt different, heavier, expectant. Garrett was 51 years old, ancient by mining camp standards. His hair had gone white during a winter spent snowblind in the Tetons, and his hands bore the scars of frostbite from too many nights sleeping in snow caves. Other miners called him Old Tom, though not with much affection. He kept to himself, worked his claim methodically, and had opinions about safety that others found excessive. His cabin sat higher up the valley wall than anyone else's, built into the hillside rather than on the flat ground near the creek where gold panning was easier. The location required him to haul water uphill, a choice other miners mocked. But Garrett had seen avalanches bury valleys. He had watched spring floods wash away settlements built too close to water. That evening, he descended to the valley's makeshift saloon, a large tent with a wooden floor where miners gathered to drink 40-rod whiskey and share lies about their claims. The atmosphere inside was warm with body heat and kerosene lamps. Marcus Webb, who ran the most successful hydraulic operation, was holding court about his plans to bring his family west come spring. The Welsh twins were arguing about whether to stay through winter or head to California. Nobody paid attention when Garrett entered. He ordered whiskey from Dutch Peterson, who kept bar when he wasn't working his own claim. "Storm coming?" Garrett said, voice gravelly from years of pipe smoke. "Big one, different kind." Dutch laughed. "Always predicting disaster, aren't you, Tom? We've wintered here 2 years already." "Got through just fine." "This isn't like those winters," Garrett insisted. "The pressure's wrong. Birds left 3 days ago, all of them, not just the seasonal migrants. You see any ravens today? Any jays? Even the ground squirrels have gone deep." Marcus Webb overheard and joined them. "Tom, you've been predicting catastrophe since you arrived. Remember last year? You swore we'd all freeze when that cold snap hit. We barely needed extra firewood." Garrett left the saloon that night without finishing his whiskey. The laughter followed him out into the darkness, where the unnatural stillness made his skin crawl. He understood why they didn't listen. The Silver Creek miners had struck it rich in a place everyone said would yield nothing. They had survived 2 winters already, built a thriving community from nothing, and pulled more gold from the ground than most 49ers ever saw. Success had made them bulletproof in their own minds. Weather was just another obstacle to overcome with determination and adequate firewood. The next morning, Garrett rode his mule down to Johnson's General Store, the only permanent wooden structure in the valley besides his own cabin. William Johnson had hauled in supplies from Fort Bridger just 2 weeks earlier, and his shelves groaned with provisions. Garrett bought things that made Johnson's eyebrows rise: 50 pounds of salt pork, 300 pounds of flour, 20 gallons of kerosene, 6 wool blankets, and every candle in stock. He paid in gold dust without haggling, something he never did. "Planning to open your own store, Tom?" Johnson asked while weighing out the flour. "This is enough for 6 months. Might be longer than that before we see another supply wagon," Garrett replied. He paused at a display of mining tools, then bought 3 extra shovels and 2 pickaxes. "You should stock up yourself, Will. Send someone into Fort Bridger while the pass is still clear." Johnson laughed. "Tom, I've got enough inventory to supply this camp through spring. Nobody's going anywhere. Peters just found a vein that assays at 3 ounces per ton. The Welsh boys hit a pocket of nuggets yesterday, big as chickpeas. You think these men are leaving that in the ground because you've got a feeling?" Word of Garrett's shopping spree spread quickly. By afternoon, miners were joking about Old Tom's Ark, suggesting he was preparing for a flood in the middle of the driest autumn anyone could remember. The mockery had an edge to it. In a community where everyone shared the same risks, Garrett's extreme preparations felt like a judgment on their own choices. His fear was an insult to their courage. Marcus Webb confronted him that evening as Garrett loaded supplies onto his mule. "You're spooking some of the newer men with this doomsday talk," Webb said. "Henderson's thinking about leaving, and I need him working the sluice. We've got contracts to fill." "Then let him leave," Garrett said, securing a barrel of salt pork with rope. "Better scared and alive than confident and frozen." "Frozen? Tom, be reasonable. We've got enough split wood to heat every cabin through January. The creek's still running strong for water. Game's plentiful. What exactly do you think is going to happen?" Garrett stopped working and looked directly at Webb. "I think nature's about to remind us how small we are. But you won't listen to me, so I'll just say this: when it starts, it won't stop. Not for days, maybe weeks. Whatever you think is enough, triple it." That night, Garrett began work on something the valley had never seen. Behind his cabin, where the hillside rose steeply, he started digging. Not mining for gold, but excavating a cave with the methodical precision of a man who had thought through every detail. He worked by lantern light, mucking out dirt and rocks with the same determination others applied to their claims. The opening was 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, angled slightly upward to prevent water infiltration. By dawn, he had tunneled 8 feet into the hillside. His hands were raw despite thick leather gloves, and his back screamed from the constant stooping, but he didn't stop. He braced the tunnel with timber from his winter wood supply, using techniques he'd learned from Welsh coal miners in Pennsylvania decades earlier. Every 4 feet, he installed a frame of thick logs, creating a structure that could support the weight of a mountain. The second day, curious miners climbed the hill to watch. Dutch Peterson brought others from the saloon, and they stood in a semicircle, passing a flask and making jokes. "Building yourself a tomb, old Tom?" someone called out. "Planning to hibernate like a bear?" added another. Garrett didn't respond. He kept digging, hauling buckets of earth out to pile beside his cabin. What they couldn't see was the design taking shape in Garrett's mind. This wasn't just a cave, it was an entire survival system. 20 feet in, he began excavating a chamber, 10 feet wide and 8 feet deep. He curved the ceiling into a dome, a shape that would distribute weight evenly if the mountain above pressed down. Along one wall, he carved sleeping platforms at different heights. Against another, he built shelving directly into the earth, reinforced with planks. The innovation that would save his life came next. Instead of a single entrance, Garrett dug a vertical shaft from the chamber up through 12 feet of earth, emerging behind his cabin near a cluster of pines. He lined this shaft with a ladder and created a cap from thick planks that could be opened from below. At intervals in the shaft, he installed small platforms, places to rest while climbing, but more importantly, spots to stage supplies. Inside the main chamber, he constructed something unprecedented. Using knowledge gleaned from a Russian trader he'd met in Alaska, Garrett built a heating system that wouldn't suffocate him underground. He installed a small iron stove he'd bought from Johnson's store, but instead of venting it directly up, He ran the stovepipe in a long loop through the chamber, extracting maximum heat before it exited. The pipe eventually connected to his vertical shaft, creating a draw that would pull fresh air through the main tunnel while exhausting smoke up and out. The Welsh twins visited on the fourth day, genuinely curious rather than mocking. "That's proper mining support work," Evan Welsh admitted, examining the timber frames. "But why build a mine that yields nothing?" "Sometimes the yield is staying alive," Garrett replied, installing another support beam. "Your coal mines back home ever collapse in winter?" "Aye, but from gas or water, not snow. Snow can weigh more than water when it piles deep enough. Ask yourself if 30 feet of wet snow landed on your cabin roof tonight. Would it hold?" On November 9th, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. Garrett was securing the last of his supplies in the underground chamber when he felt the pressure change hit his chest like a physical blow. He climbed out through his vertical shaft and stood behind his cabin, watching the northwestern horizon turn a color he'd only seen once before, the gray-green of old iron left in acid. The clouds moved with unnatural speed, boiling over the mountain peaks like water over a dam. He had maybe 2 hours. Garrett worked with desperate efficiency, hauling his remaining supplies from the cabin to the cave. Food, tools, kerosene, blankets, ammunition, everything that could sustain life went underground. He filled every container with water from his rain barrels, knowing the creek would soon be buried beyond reach. His mule, sensing danger, fought the lead rope as Garrett tried to stable it in the lean-to he'd reinforced with extra timber. The first flakes arrived at dusk, tiny and sharp as ground glass. They didn't drift down but drove horizontally, propelled by winds that screamed through the valley like a living thing. Within minutes, visibility dropped to 10 feet. Garrett made his final trip to the cabin, gathering his rifles, medical supplies, and the leather journal where he kept weather observations dating back 15 years. Through his window, he could see lamps lighting in the valley below, miners just beginning to understand this wasn't an ordinary storm. By full dark, the snow fell so thick it eliminated the concept of air. Garrett had experienced blizzards in the Rockies, nor'easters in Maine, and ice storms on the Great Lakes, but this was different. The snow didn't accumulate, it materialized, appearing in solid walls that built faster than seemed possible. He watched his woodpile disappear in 20 minutes, then his rain barrels, then the lower portion of his cabin walls. The wind found every gap in his construction, driving snow through spaces he didn't know existed. He made the decision at midnight. The cabin groaned under the weight already accumulating on its roof. Snow had drifted past the windows, turning the interior into a dark cave lit only by his kerosene lamp. Garrett gathered his immediate essentials: lamp, matches, his journal, and the rifle he always kept loaded, and headed for the tunnel entrance. The wind tried to tear the door from its hinges when he opened it. Snow had already piled 3 feet deep against the entrance in the few hours since nightfall. Garrett fought through the drift and into his tunnel. The contrast was immediate, from howling chaos to muffled quiet. He pulled the heavy door shut behind him and barred it with timber he'd prepared for this purpose. 20 feet through the tunnel, he reached his chamber. The lamp revealed his supplies neatly arranged, the stove ready to light, his underground shelter exactly as he'd planned it. But standing there, in the sudden stillness, listening to the muted scream of wind above, Garrett realized he'd underestimated one thing. He had no idea how long he'd be trapped here. The first 24 hours underground tested every calculation Garrett had made. Above him, the storm intensified beyond anything the atmospheric pressure had warned him about. The sound was constant, not wind anymore, but a deep grinding roar, like millstones made of air and ice. Every few hours he climbed the vertical shaft to check the upper exit. By dawn of the second day, he couldn't push the hatch open. Snow had sealed it with weight he estimated at several hundred pounds per square foot. His thermometer, hung in the main tunnel, showed temperatures dropping steadily. -20°C became -30, then -40. The earth walls of his chamber provided insulation, but without the stove, he would have frozen within hours. Garrett had stockpiled enough wood in the chamber for 2 weeks of constant burning. He now rationed it carefully, maintaining just enough heat to keep from freezing, knowing this storm could outlast his initial estimates. The isolation was immediate and total. In the valley below, he knew miners were discovering what he had tried to warn them about. Their cabins, built for normal winters, would be groaning under snow loads they were never designed to support. Windows would be buried, then doors. The weight would find every weak point in construction: poorly supported roofs, walls with inadequate bracing, corners where logs didn't fit tightly. He wondered about Dutch Peterson, the Welsh twins, Marcus Webb with his plans to bring family west. Were they digging out constantly, or had they already been overwhelmed? On the third day, Garrett heard the first collapse. The sound transmitted through earth and snow, a deep whump, followed by vibrations he felt in his boots. A cabin roof giving way, maybe a quarter-mile distant. He made a mark in his journal. 2 hours later, another collapse, this one closer. The storm was systematically crushing the valley's infrastructure, building by building. Each failure would trap or kill anyone inside, and in these temperatures, being trapped was just a slower form of dying. He established routines to maintain sanity. Morning meant checking both entrances, though neither could open. Midday meant preparing one hot meal on his stove, usually salt pork and biscuits cooked in melted snow. Afternoon meant maintaining his equipment, cleaning rifles that didn't need cleaning, sharpening tools already sharp, organizing supplies already organized. Evening meant writing in his journal by lamplight, documenting everything for whoever might find it if his calculations proved wrong. The fourth day brought a new sound scratching above his main tunnel entrance. Something was digging at his door from outside. Not human digging, wrong rhythm for that. Garrett listened for an hour before realizing what it was. Wolves or coyotes, desperate enough to dig through snow, trying to reach any shelter. They couldn't get through his barred door, but their presence meant the wildlife was dying too. Nothing could survive in what was happening above. The scratching continued intermittently for 6 hours before stopping. He never heard it again. By the seventh day, Garrett's underground world had become a functioning ecosystem of survival. His stove performed perfectly, the chimney design drawing smoke up through the shaft without backdrafting. He melted snow in a continuous rotation of pots, storing water in every available container. The temperature in his chamber stabilized at just above freezing cold enough to preserve his food supplies, but warm enough to prevent ice from forming on the walls. His journal entries revealed a mind adapting to extreme isolation. Day 7, used 8 pounds flour, 2 pounds salt pork, stove consumes 1 log every 4 hours at minimum burn. Estimate 60 days supplies remaining if storm continues. No sound from above except wind. Snow must be 20 feet deep by now, based on pressure calculations. The vertical shaft shows compression snow weight beginning to affect even protected entrances. Reinforced shaft walls with spare timber. Holding for now. What saved Garrett wasn't just the cave, but the systematic thinking that went into it. He had positioned ventilation holes at angles that prevented snow infiltration while maintaining airflow. His food storage used different temperature zones within the chamber. Frozen goods near the entrance tunnel where cold air settled, preserved items on the warmer upper shelves. He had even created a primitive calendar, marking days on the earth wall to maintain temporal awareness. On the 10th day, the storm's voice changed. The grinding roar softened to a steady whisper. Garrett climbed his shaft and felt less resistance at the hatch. Using a pike he'd stored on one of the platforms, he managed to punch through. The pike went up 5 feet before hitting air. 5 feet of snow above his exit, which itself was 12 feet above ground level. The mathematics were staggering: 17 feet of snow minimum, likely much deeper in the valley. He widened the hole enough to squeeze through and emerged into a world transformed. The storm had ended, replaced by crystalline cold under brilliant stars. But the landscape was unrecognizable. His cabin's roof peak, which should have been visible nearby, was gone. The entire structure was buried. Down in the valley, where 43 miners had built their dreams, he saw only smooth white undulations. Not a single structure remained visible. The creek, the trails, the equipment, everything had vanished beneath a blanket of snow so deep it had erased topography itself. The temperature gauge he pulled up showed -52 Celsius. At that temperature, exposed skin freezes in under 60 seconds. Garrett retreated to his chamber, understanding the grim truth. The storm had ended, but the disaster was just beginning. Anyone who had survived the burial would now face cold that killed as efficiently as any avalanche. Without shelter, without the ability to maintain heat, without access to food or water, the valley's population was dying by minutes, not days. He made a decision that haunted him forever. He couldn't help them. To attempt rescue would mean his own death. He had neither the equipment nor physical capability to dig through 17 feet of snow to reach cabins that might already be crushed. Garrett sealed his shaft exit with canvas and boards, leaving only a small ventilation hole, and returned to his chamber to wait for what he knew was coming: the long silence that follows when a community dies. 2 days after the storm ended, Garrett heard the first human sounds from above, muffled shouting, barely audible through 17 feet of snow. Someone had survived the initial burial and was trying to dig out. The voice came from the direction of the valley, probably near where the saloon tent had stood. Garrett climbed his shaft again, emerging into bitter daylight. The cold hit like a physical assault, minus 56 Celsius, according to his thermometer. He tried to triangulate the shouting, but sound behaved strangely in the snow-muffled landscape. After an hour of careful listening, he identified 2 distinct voices, maybe 3. They were attempting to dig upward from their burial point, an almost impossible task. Garrett did quick calculations. Even if they broke through, they would emerge into lethal cold with no shelter, no food, no way to maintain heat. Their situation was hopeless unless they could reach his position. Garrett attempted something that violated every survival instinct. He gathered rope, his pike, and emergency supplies, then began cutting a traverse across the snow slope toward the voices. The snow was wind-packed on top, but loose underneath treacherous conditions that could avalanche without warning. He made it 30 yards before, hitting an invisible depression. The snow gave way, and he plunged chest-deep into powder. Fighting panic, Garrett used his pike to probe for solid ground, eventually hauling himself out. The voices had stopped. Whether they'd given up, succumbed, or simply couldn't be heard anymore, he'd never know. Over the following days, Garrett witnessed 3 more rescue attempts from his elevated position. Each told the same desperate story. On day 15, he saw movement near where Dutch Peterson's trading post should be. A dark hole appeared in the snow, and a figure emerged, crawling, not walking. The person made it perhaps 20 feet before collapsing. Garrett watched through his field glasses as the figure tried to rise, failed, tried again, then stopped moving. Within an hour, blowing snow had covered the body. The hole remained visible for 2 more days before drifting shut. The most organized attempt came on day 18. Multiple holes appeared near the center of the valley, suggesting a group had survived in one of the larger structures and coordinated their escape. 5 figures emerged, roped together. They had clearly planned. This one carried what looked like supplied, another had tools. They began moving toward the valley's eastern slope, probably trying to reach the trail to Fort Bridger. Garrett watched them struggle through chest-deep snow for 3 hours. The cold was visible in their movements, the increasing stumbles, the shortening steps, the way they stopped more frequently to rest. They made it a quarter mile before the leader fell and didn't rise. The others gathered around, and Garrett could see the desperation in their movements. 2 of them tried to carry the fallen leader, but in deep snow and extreme cold, it was impossible. One by one, they dropped. The last figure standing untied himself from the rope and continued alone for another 100 yards before sitting down in the snow. He never got up. By morning, wind had erased all trace of their attempt. Spring arrived in late April, 4 months after the storm. Garrett had survived on his stockpiled supplies, emerging only when necessary to collect fresh snow for water and check conditions. His journal documented every detail: 68 days of continuous sub-zero temperatures, 12 major wind events that redistributed snow into new patterns, and the slow, inevitable silence that settled over Silver Creek Valley. By March, he had stopped looking for signs of other survivors. The melt began suddenly. Warm Chinook winds swept down from the mountains, raising temperatures 40 degrees in 2 days. Snow that had seemed permanent began settling, compressing, revealing shapes beneath. Garrett watched from his cabin, which emerged from its burial like a ship from fog. The structure had survived, testament to his reinforced construction, though snow pressure had buckled one wall. He spent days digging out, creating paths to his underground chamber, salvaging what remained of his above-ground supplies. As the snow receded, the valley revealed its secrets. The first body appeared near where the saloon had stood, a figure preserved by cold, still wearing the heavy coat and boots of a miner. Garrett recognized him as Timothy Harrison, one of the younger men who'd laughed at his preparations. Over the following weeks, the melt exposed more victims. Some had died in their cabins when roofs collapsed. Others had perished trying to dig out. A few had made it considerable distances before cold claimed them. The Welsh twins were found together in what remained of their cabin. They'd reinforced their roof with extra beams. Garrett could see where they'd tried to hold it up, but the weight had been too much. Marcus Webb's cabin had partially survived, but Webb himself was discovered 100 yards away, apparently caught outside when the storm hit. He'd tried to reach shelter but hadn't made it. Dutch Peterson's trading post, the most substantial building in Emsek, the valley, had imploded. The heavy inventory that Johnson had boasted about became deadly weight when snow accumulated. Garrett spent May documenting everything. He felt an obligation to record how each man died, where they were found, what they'd attempted. His journal became a methodical catalog of disaster. 23 confirmed dead out of 43 miners. The remaining 20 were never found, either buried too deep or swept away by avalanche. Some might have attempted escape early in the storm and died miles from the valley. The spring melt would reveal bodies for years to come. In early June, a supply train from Fort Bridger arrived to find Garrett alone in a valley of abandoned claims. The traders couldn't comprehend the scale of what had happened until Garrett showed them his journal, walked them through the remains, pointed out where buildings had stood. They helped him build a mass grave on the hillside, marking it with a wooden cross that simply read, "Winter, 1842-43, 23 souls, the mountain keeps its own." The gold that had drawn these men to Silver Creek meant nothing now. Claims went unworked, equipment rusted where it lay. The mountain had reclaimed its solitude with interest. The supply train from Fort Bridger brought food and witnesses. Among them was John Hoffman, a civilian surveyor attached to the Army's topographical engineers, traveling to chart winter passes. He listened while Garrett read from his journal, ran a hand across the tunnel's timber sets, and traced the long stovepipe like a river on a map. Hoffman did not ask why Garrett had dug, he asked how. For 3 days he turned observation into instruction. He sketched the chamber's shallow dome and the escape shaft with rest platforms set by a man's reach. He noted shelving arranged by height to use the tunnel's temperature gradient, frozen meat near the mouth, flour and lamp oil higher where breath would not rhyme. He tested draft by holding ash near each joint and watching smoke bend toward the vertical. He bored the snowpack with an iron auger and logged the layers in pencil: wind slab, facets, crust, late storm sugar. When he left, he carried sentences copied in a neat hand: "Designed for load you cannot see, heat slow, vent long. Put your second door where snow cannot find it." He carried one of Garrett's timber templates, each notch showing spacing for beams when the sky turned to stone. By August, word outran the mules. At Fort Bridger, the story went north with Beaver men. At Bent's Fort, it crossed fire rings to the Arkansas. In Street, Louis, a clerk, recopied Hoffman's drawing into a broadsheet and labeled it the Garrett Shelter. No one argued with the name. 43 men had wintered in Silver Creek. One stood to show how. Across the Rockies that autumn, camps built like men who had read a map to a graveyard. Roofs gained redundant beams and steeper pitches to shed weight. Cabins migrated from creek bottoms to bench cuts scoured by wind. Snow fences rose upwind of doors. Cords for latches ran from inside to shovel stakes outside. Most of all, outfits dug. Storage caves appeared behind smithies. Root cellars became rooms. Escape shafts rose as warm chimneys capped with hinged planks one person could lift from beneath. Hoffman, writing from Fort Laramie in December, reduced the method to 3 rules pinned to sutlers' doors: build into earth, not against it; separate flame from smoke long enough to harvest its heat; to design redundant exits for days without sky. The circular traveled with cartridges and calico, copied poorly in some places and improved in others. A Crow interpreter cut toe notches where men had nailed ladders. A Bear River carpenter lengthened the stove loop to save wood and steady draft. That winter brought 3 hard storms. None equaled the White Death, but each would have buried complacency. This time, camps did not vanish. Men breathed air that did, to not suffocate them. Women kept stew pots moving on stoves that drew steady. Children learned the ladder rungs by feel. Where survival once looked like luck, the mountains began to repay instruction with life. Garrett never called it invention. He said the mountain had told him its terms, and he had finally listened. In the summer after the White Death, he rebuilt the buckled cabin wall, repaired the shaft cap the wind had chewed, and stacked wood as if winter lived behind every tree. When strangers rode in to see the shelter, he showed the tunnel, the stove loop, the dome, and then sent them away with a warning. The system worked only if built before pride set the nails. Hoffman returned once, 2 years later, carrying a printed circular. He had added a diagram of snow load by pitch and a table of timber spacing. He asked Garrett to sign it. Garrett declined. "Put the mountain's name there," he said, tapping the margin. Hoffman laughed and penciled Silver Creek Method at the bottom. The name did not stick. Teamsters and trappers still called it the Garrett Shelter because the words were shorter to shout. Change arrived as small choices repeated across ranges. Cabins crept upslope a little each year. Doors swung inward less often. Escape ladders were built in summer, not after the first drift. Stoves were piped long and low for heat recovery, then turned upward to find the draft. Practical men laid timber into earth because graves had been chopped in permafrost, and journals recorded timings and temperatures that turned argument into arithmetic. In later winters, families climbed interior ladders and lifted capped hatches into star-cold air, then climbed back down to stir stew pots and oil lamp wicks. Children learned to count by notches on vertical shafts. Traders stocked short stovepipe elbows for loops, and smiths hammered hinge pins pullable with gloves. Chiefs and preachers borrowed the rules when they taught, build into earth, harvest heat, never trust a single door. Garrett lived another decade in the valley that had once held 43 dreams. He prospected poorly. He repaired neighbors' roof frames. Well, he hauled water uphill until a ram pump made the hill do the lifting. In old age, he walked with a slow confidence bordering on apology, as if he had survived by accident and spent the rest of his days paying the bill by teaching. When winters came hard, men found him at other camps, chalking dough marks on planks and counting rafter spacing aloud so novices could hear the math. He died in late autumn, before the first deep snow. A few men rode in from distant posts. One brought the broadsheet that printed Hoffman's drawing. Another carried a stove elbow fashioned like the one in the tunnel. They buried Garrett on the bench above his cabin, where Chinook winds would find his grave first each spring. Snow fell that night and did not last. Under clear stars, then thin clouds, the mountains kept their terms. People kept the method. And each winter, when roofs creaked and the air turned to glass, doors inside the earth opened and families breathed.